Hi, my name is Rein Henrichs, and my talk is about blame, blameless post-mortems, where we went wrong, and what we can do about it. So blameless post-mortems comes from a talk by John Allspaw in 2012, and the basic idea was that when an incident happens, if we punish people who were involved in the incident, we hurt those people, we make them less likely to help in the future, and we make it harder to learn about the incident and to learn from the incident. And all of those things are true. So why am I saying that blameless culture is making us less resilient? And the reason is that people who tried to create a blameless culture did so by trying to avoid blame, because that's what blameless means, but they didn't really understand what blame is. And this has led to some pretty counterproductive behaviors that have really become entrenched as what blamelessness is today. And there's one in particular that I want to talk about. It's this idea that we don't ask who questions here because we're blameless. And you can also see this in PagerDuty's old blog post. I think they've changed this wording now, but it used to say that we want to understand how a mistake was made instead of who made the mistake. And I get where this comes from. When knowing who did something leads to punishing that person, wouldn't it be better to not know who did it? The problem is that while attribution can lead to blame, or more specifically to sanction, or more specifically still to over-sanction. So Allspaw's blog post said punishment and retribution. So an amount of sanction that is more than we think is acceptable. Well, the idea is if attribution leads to over-sanction, just stop doing that. Stop attribution and you can stop over-sanction. But this is a lot like saying, we want to prevent planes from crashing, so we'll just make them not take off anymore. Because planes can't fall out of the sky if they're never in the sky in the first place. The problem here is that just like planes flying through the sky is necessary for the global economy, attribution, while it can lead to over-sanction, is also necessary for learning. And actually, if you read John Allspaw's original blog post, he says that we need attribution to learn from the people who were there what actions they took, what effects they observed, what expectations they had, what assumptions they made, and in general, how did they understand the events as they were unfolding. We need attribution so that the people who did the stuff can tell us about the stuff they did. This is what Sidney Dekker calls getting in the tunnel with the worker. So this doesn't work. If we say no to attribution, we're also saying no to learning. The good news is that there's an alternative. We can have our attribution and our learning if we just prevent knowing who did something from leading to punishment. And so what we really need to do is to understand this little arrow here between attribution and sanction. And if you read a bunch of moral cognition papers, what you'll learn is that that little arrow there is blame. What I mean by that is that blame is the cognitive process which starts with attribution and can lead to sanction. And what we actually want to do is not remove blame. What we actually want to do is to have attribution lead to a socially appropriate amount of sanction, which in these circumstances is almost always none. So if blame actually works properly from the perspective of our social norms, then we won't over-sanction. And so the question we need to answer is, how can we know who did stuff without punishing them? And I'm going to suggest two things. The first is that we can create a context that reduces harmful blaming behaviors. And the second is that when these behaviors do happen, we can intervene. Now, in order to do this, we need a better understanding of what blame is and how it works. So we'll begin, as all good talks do, with ontology. What is blame? Well, the moral psychology papers say that blame is a concrete moral judgment with a cognitive and social nature. Concrete meaning it's about a specific event rather than just a sort of general moral judgment. It has a cognitive nature because it happens in the mind. It has a social nature because it leads to behaviors that impact your society, your community. And then we need to think about, why do we blame? What function or role is blame serving? Why does it even exist? And actually the answer is that blame provides social regulation. So because blame is a social behavior, and because blame regulates social behavior, blame actually regulates itself. Members of a community can correct expressions of premature, biased, or inaccurate moral judgment by challenging the people who blurt out these allegations and asking them to justify that sanction. And when we do this by enforcing these social norms about blame, we slow the process of accusation and punishment. So if we want to be able to slow this process of accusation and punishment, we need to understand how that process works. We need a good model of what this process is so we can find good ways to intervene. So how does blame work? How do we do it? It's complicated. We perceive a stream of events and we don't like some of them. And for some of the ones we don't like, some brain stuff happens and that leads to a sanction. And that sanction has to have a warrant. And the warrant is the justification we could give, which explains why we believe the sanction is appropriate. And for a lot of negative events, we don't sanction anyone. And when we do, we can be expected to provide that warrant when we're asked for it. So to dig into this brain stuff box, we need to talk about moral psychology for a while. And I realize that people don't like moral psychology, but just stick with me for a second. So this goes back to Kant and Hume and the idea that moral judgment is either rational or passionate. So the typical analytical model is the model from a theory of blame that is called the path model of blame. And this says that when a negative event happens, we start by asking whether it was a norm violation, because blame, sanctioning someone for something that didn't violate any social norms, is a category error. And then we ask, if it was a social norm violation, whether that person was the cause of that violation. And if they were, we ask, did they intend to violate that norm? And if they did, then we ask, do they have some justification for why they violated that social norm? And if the answer to all of these questions is yes, then we can be justified in applying some sanction. And at any point along this path, there's an off-ramp that leads to no sanctioning. The problem with this model is that it's wrong because brains don't work this way. In particular, brains don't work like flowcharts. The other problem is that it ignores the intuitive or passionate aspects of blame, because blame is also often intuitive and driven by natural impulsive desires to defend and uphold social values. So what we actually need is a model that combines both analytic and intuitive. We need to find a synthesis here. We need a holistic model. And the model we're going to use is what's called the parallel processes model. And this model says that actually the intuitive stuff and the rational stuff happens together. They sort of mutually reinforce each other. And that both intuitive and deliberative processes simultaneously lead to the construction of moral judgments. This is good news because these intuitive judgments can be tempered by a more deliberative process. When people have the capability and the motivation to reason, this will improve the moral judgments that they construct. So there's some other things about brains and why they don't work very good that we need to understand to get a handle on blame. The first is that brains fill in the gaps. So when you look at this image, you see a panda, I assume. But the outline of the panda isn't really there. It's just a collection of squiggly shapes. But when we see this image, our brain fills in the panda, fills in the rest of the panda. And this same thing happens in moral cognition, and it's called dyadic completion. And in this case, what happens is that when we see a victim, we will fill in the villain, even if one doesn't exist. So, for example, people blamed Obama for his Hurricane Katrina response, even though he wasn't president when it happened, because there were victims, and because of this desire to complete the picture, we will find a villain. And the thing is that just like you didn't intentionally, consciously construct the panda, the image of the panda just arose fully formed to your conscious awareness. This dyadic completion where we construct a villain isn't conscious. And there's a particular form that this takes in incidents, which is that failure is completed with human error. This is also why blame can be unreasonable. Other people call it irrational, but I'm going to call it unreasonable because rationality is overrated. We sometimes blame people when they don't deserve it, but we sometimes blame others when we know that they don't deserve it. We need to find a villain, and when we find that villain, we blame them, even if there's no there. We also know that blame is affective. Just like we can't control whether we feel angry, we can't control how these intuitive moral judgments arise. And so just like Mr. Rogers asked, what do you do with the mad that you feel? We have to ask what we can do about the blame that arises affectively, that comes up into our consciousness with this evaluation already done, and with this feeling like we need to blame someone. So the question is, how can we know who did stuff without punishing them? And I'm going to suggest that there are two opportunities we have. The first is that we can create a context that reduces these harmful blaming behaviors. Herbert Simon had this wonderful parable or thought experiment. So this thought experiment is now called Simon's Ant. And the idea is this. If you trace the path that an ant takes through the jungle as it climbs over this log and around this puddle, and it goes to confer with its comrade and so on. And if you just plot that path in 3D space, but you remove the context of the jungle, the path will be nonsensical. You can't make sense of the way that ant behaved unless you know the context that ant was in when it was behaving. And so this is why one of Todd Conklin's 5 principles of human performance is that context drives behavior. So leaders and facilitators of postmortems have an opportunity here. By understanding how we get to destructive blame, we can create contexts where that's less likely to happen. And this is what the Agile Prime Directive does. It primes people to believe that everyone was doing the best job they could. And we know that immediately prior mental states have a huge influence on the moral judgments we construct. We also know that people with access to more cognitive resources make better moral judgments. This means how much stress are they under? How much pressure are they under? How exhausted are you at the end of the day? When we have more cognitive resources, we make better moral judgments. Our other opportunity is to intervene when these harmful blaming behaviors do happen. And one way we can intervene is by prompting people to recruit more deliberative cognitive processes. Since we know that people who engage in more deliberate moral judgments end up with better moral judgments, if we can get people to recruit these more deliberative processes, they won't punish people as much. And so this is why I mentioned the path model. Even though it's wrong, it's actually useful as a facilitation cheat sheet, because you can look at all of these steps as opportunities for people to recruit a cognitive process that will lead to them not over-sanctioning. So if we can ask questions that prompt people to think about causality and intentionality and what justifications they may have had for acting in the way they did, we can make punishment and retribution less likely. And in fact, we can take advantage of our finely tuned moral cognition and the fact that blame reinforces social norms. We can use blame, not punishment, but the cognitive process of blame and the moral communication that it leads to reinforce social norms about blame. So here's how this works. There's this domain of socially acceptable behavior that's defined by your community's, your organization's social norms. When someone violates a social norm and pushes beyond that boundary, you can apply a finely tuned sanction to push them back. And by making decisions about how we intervene, what sort of sanctions we apply, what we choose to sanction, what we choose not to sanction, how we communicate morally, we also construct this envelope of socially acceptable behavior. And so leaders and facilitators can be the horrible geese of social regulation by using the process of blame to find sanctions and moral communication that makes it clear that punishment and retribution aren't socially acceptable. And so we have to be able to craft careful sanctions to cope with harmful blame. And one way we can think about these sanctions is as a matrix of, on one hand, are these expressed towards the violator or not towards the violator? And on the other hand, how intense is the expression? So if we look back to, we don't ask who questions here because we are blameless, we can see that it's not intense and that it's not directed towards the violator, because in this case, by asking a who question, I had violated an established social norm. And the facilitator, by being aware that I had violated a norm and finding a careful and compassionate sanction, was able to reinforce that norm and moderate my behavior. And in fact, I stopped asking who questions there. Now, I disagree with that norm itself, which is why I'm giving this talk, but I thought that as a facilitator, his intervention was really effective. And so if we can craft these interventions that find ways to sanction people and reinforce our social norms without hurting them, then we can reduce the harms caused by punishment and retribution. And in fact, we have an obligation to do this. We have an obligation. We have a professional obligation and we have a moral obligation to not hurt people. And we can do this, we can fulfill this obligation by being careful about constructing contexts that give people the time and space to be more deliberative about the moral judgments that they're constructing. And by intervening carefully and compassionately when harmful blaming behaviors do violate social norms. So instead of trying to be blameless, we need to recognize that blame is natural. And we need to build a context in which people can ask who questions safely, and in which sanctions are deployed with care and empathy, both for our community and the people we sanction. And that's it. I don't really know how to end these, so please tweet at me if you would like to give me some feedback, and I would love to hear from you.